Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. We've got an incredible analysis of the story for you today, one that I think really digs deep into the symbolism and really explores, why this story continues to kind of fascinate us even centuries later.
It really is a masterclass in Gothic horror, and I think what makes it even more intriguing is how closely it's these themes of decay and disintegration mirror Poe's own life, which was very troubled.
Oh, okay. Yeah, tell me a little bit about that. I don't know a lot about Poe's background, but I'd love to hear how that maybe, influenced his writing.
Yeah, so imagine being born in 1809 and, experiencing a life that's just riddled with personal tragedies. Both of Poe's parents died when he was really young, and he faced constant financial struggles throughout his life. And he also battled addiction. So, it's almost as if he poured all of that darkness and turmoil into his writing.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. So how does the fall of the House of Usher specifically reflect those darker themes? I know you mentioned Gothic horror. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for me?
Yeah, so Poe is considered a key figure in dark romanticism, and that was a movement that really pushed back against the optimistic ideals of the Enlightenment and instead explored the darker side of human nature, the power of the subconscious, and also, the inevitability of things like decay and death, and the fall of the House of Usher really embodies all of those themes.
Yeah, and you mentioned decay, and it seems like that's a pretty central theme in the story, right?
Oh, absolutely. It permeates every aspect of the story. So you have this crumbling mansion, you have a family that's on the verge of extinction, and you have Roderick Usher, who's the main character, and he's slowly losing his grip on reality. And the house itself is almost like a character because these decaying walls, really mirror the psychological and physical disintegration of the Usher family.
It's so interesting how the house becomes this symbol of the family's decline, and then you have this still dark tarn that's reflecting the mansion, and it just adds another layer of creepiness to the atmosphere. What do you make of that detail?
The tarn is such a brilliant symbolic element because it reflects the house, right? So it's visually doubling that imagery of decay, and it really suggests this distorted perception of reality, that things are not as they seem. And then I think on a deeper level, the tarn might also represent the murky depths of the subconscious where secrets and repressed desires, kind of fester.
Now, I remember that Roderick has a twin sister, Madeline, and let's just say things get pretty bizarre with her. Can you remind us what happens and what her role in the story might symbolize?
Yeah, so Madeline is such a fascinating character because she suffers from this mysterious illness and she's prematurely buried in the family vault. But in a truly chilling twist, she seemingly returns from the grave, and that leads to the story's, very horrifying climax.
That's one of those memorable scenes in the story. What do you think Poe is trying to convey with that resurrection?
I think it speaks to the power of the subconscious, the idea that repressed fears and desires can't stay buried forever. They eventually break free, often with pretty devastating consequences. And so Madeline's return can be seen as a manifestation of those repressed elements, a symbol of the unconscious overwhelming the rational mind.
That makes me think of Freudian psychoanalysis. Would you say that lens is helpful in understanding this story?
Absolutely. A Freudian reading would see Madeline as a representation of Roderick's repressed desires, the Ergen's urges, breaking through the constraints of the ego. And if you remember, Roderick is hypersensitive. He's isolated. He's deeply afraid of Madeline's illness, so he's repressing those fears, but ultimately they consume him.
That's a really interesting interpretation, and the fact that they're twins adds another layer of complexity to their relationship, right? It's almost as if they represent two halves of a whole.
Exactly. They embody that duality of human nature, the mind and the body, reason and instinct, and their fates are intertwined, right? Suggesting that these forces can't exist in isolation. The collapse of one inevitably leads to the downfall of the other.
Yeah, and we've got this fascinating dynamic between Roderick and Madeline, right? And this interplay of reason and instinct. But I'm also struck by the incredible detail that Poe uses to just create the atmosphere. It's not just what happens, but how he describes it.
Right, and that's one of the hallmarks of Poe's genius, is that he so carefully crafts every detail to enhance the mood and the meaning of the story. And I think a great example of this is that fissure that runs down the front of the Usher mansion. It's not just a random architectural flaw.
I've always been curious about that, Crack. What do you make of it?
Oh, it's a powerful visual metaphor for the fragmentation that's happening on multiple levels. You have the literal fragmentation of the house itself, right, which foreshadows its ultimate collapse. But it also symbolizes the psychological and moral fragmentation of the Usher family. They're falling apart from within, just like their ancestral home.
And that ties back to the idea of decay as this like central theme, right? It's not just physical, but it's psychological and moral as well.
Exactly. Poe layers those meanings so effectively. And then remember that tarn that we talked about before. Its reflection of the house just reinforces this sense of duality and distortion. It's like a visual echo of the twins themselves, Roderick and Madeline, and their interconnected fates.
Yeah, it's amazing how Poe uses these seemingly simple elements, like a crack in a wall or a reflecting pool, to convey such complex ideas. Are there any other symbols in the story we should be paying attention to?
Well, let's consider Madeline's illness. It's never clearly defined, which I think adds to the mystery and the dread of the story. Some scholars have interpreted it as a representation of the repressed instinctual side of human nature, the part of us that's often, buried beneath societal expectations.
So her illness could be seen as symbolic of those aspects of ourselves that we try to hide or deny.
Exactly. And her premature burial and her subsequent resurrection further emphasize that idea, right? That these buried impulses, these primal instincts, can't be contained forever. They're going to erupt sometimes in terrifying ways.
It's interesting you mentioned primal instincts because Roderick seems to represent the opposite, like the overly intellectual, artistic side of humanity.
Yes, and that's where that duality comes in again. Roderick is hypersensitive, he's isolated, and he's obsessed with morbid thoughts. So he represents the dangers of a purely intellectual existence, one that's kind of detached from the physical realities of life. And so his descent into madness serves as this warning about the importance of balance, between mind and body, reason and instinct.
Yeah, it makes me think about how Poe uses music and art in the story. I'm thinking specifically about the poem that Roderick recites, The Haunted Palace, and then the paintings that the narrator describes seeing in the house.
Right, and those details are crucial because that poem, with its themes of a once glorious palace falling into decay, directly parallels the decline of the Usher family in their home. And the paintings, which are described as disturbing and grotesque, reflect Roderick's increasingly, disturbed mental state. So Poe isn't just telling us about Roderick's decline, he's showing us through these artistic expressions.
Right, it's like those artistic creations become windows into Roderick's troubled psyche. Poe is such a master of using symbolism to create such a rich, multi-layered story. But beyond the symbolism and psychological depth, the fall of the House of Usher also had a huge impact on the literary world, right?
Oh, absolutely. This story really helped solidify Poe's reputation as this pioneer of Gothic horror, and his use of atmospheric, psychological suspense, grotesque imagery influenced countless writers that came after him.
And I've heard that The Fall of the House of Usher was a major influence on H.P. Lovecraft, who's one of my favorite horror writers. Can you tell me more about that connection?
Yeah, well, both Poe and Lovecraft were masters of creating that sense of cosmic dread, that feeling of being confronted by these vast, unknowable forces beyond human comprehension. And they both use things like isolated settings, crumbling architecture, psychologically tortured characters to evoke that sense of unease and terror in the reader.
It's so fascinating to see how those themes and techniques carry through from Poe's work to later horror writers.
Right.
And it's not just literature, right? The Fall of the House of Usher has been adapted into numerous films and even inspired music and visual art.
Exactly. And I think it's that story's visual power, its haunting atmosphere, and its exploration of, I think, some really universal fears make it just ripe for adaptation across different mediums because it speaks to something really deep within the human psyche, something that I think transcends time and cultural boundaries.
It's incredible how a story written almost 2 centuries ago can still resonate so strongly with audiences today. I'm curious, though, beyond the literary and artistic legacy, does The Fall of the House of Usher have anything to say about society as a whole? Like, is there a broader message that we can take away from it?
That's a great question and one worth considering, I think, very carefully. If we view the House of Usher as a microcosm of society, then its collapse could be interpreted as this warning about the fragility of any system that's built on a shaky foundation.
I see what you mean. Like the decay and disintegration that we see in the story could be a reflection of those same forces at work in the world around us.
Precisely. Poe might be urging us to look for the cracks in our own systems, the signs of decay and decline that often go unnoticed until it's too late.
That's a pretty chilling thought. But it also makes the story even more relevant to our lives today.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can't ignore those warning signs, those subtle hints of decay that can ultimately lead to a complete and utter fall.
Yeah, it's almost like Poe is giving us this cautionary tale. urging us to pay attention to the cracks in our own lives and the world around us. But what does it actually mean to confront those cracks? Where do we even begin?
I think that's where the real challenge lies. It requires a willingness to look inward, to acknowledge our own shadows, those parts of ourselves that we'd rather, keep hidden. And I think it's about recognizing that decay is a natural part of life, but if it's unchecked, it can really consume us.
So it's not just about fixing the external cracks, right? Like the obvious signs of decay, but it's also about addressing the internal ones as well, the things we might be trying to ignore or suppress.
Right, exactly. Think about Roderick Usher. He was so consumed by his fear and his isolation that he couldn't see the decay that was happening all around him. And he was trapped in his own mind, completely detached from reality.
It makes me think about the ending of the story. It's not exactly a happy one, is it?
No, it's not. The House of Usher collapses, both literally and figuratively, taking Roderick and Madeline with it. And it's a bleak ending, but it's also a powerful one, I think, because it suggests that ignoring those cracks, those warning signs, can lead to complete and utter destruction.
So what can we learn from this? How can we prevent our own fall, so to speak?
I think it starts with self-awareness. We need to be honest with ourselves about our own fears, our own anxieties, the things that might be holding us back. And we need to be willing to confront those shadows and really work towards integration, bringing those hidden parts of ourselves into the light.
And it's like that idea of balance that we talked about before, the need for both reason and instinct, mind and body. We can't just deny one in favor of the other.
Exactly. It's about finding that equilibrium, that harmony between those different aspects of ourselves. And it's not always easy. It takes work and attention. But I think the fall of the House of Usher reminds us that the alternative is far worse.
It's definitely a story that stays with you long after you finish reading it. It's unsettling, thought-provoking, and ultimately, I think, a call to action.
Yeah, I agree. It challenges us to look deeper, to question our assumptions, and to just be more mindful of the forces, both internal and external, that can lead to, decay and destruction.
So for those listening who haven't experienced this haunting tale, I highly recommend checking it out. It's a journey into the darkest corners of the human psyche, but it's also a reminder of our own resilience and our capacity for growth.
And as you delve into Poe's world, I think it's important to ask yourself, where are the cracks in my own life? What am I ignoring? And what steps can I take to prevent my own fall?
Those are powerful questions and ones worth pondering. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fall of the House of Usher. We hope this exploration has given you some new insights into this timeless tale and its enduring relevance. Until next time, keep diving deep.